All right, I think I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's virtual town hall, Leading During a Pandemic. My name is Marie LeBlanc, the Director of Design at Independent Sector. I'll be facilitating the discussion to ensure we stay on time and get to your questions today. Some housekeeping notes before I turn it over to IS's President and CEO, Dan Cardinale, and our other speakers. Jeff Moore, IS's Chief Strategy Officer, Preeta Nayak, Partner at the Bridgespan Group, and Maria Orozco, Principal at the Bridgespan Group. Please feel free to share your thoughts, questions, and feedback using the chat box and the Q&A box throughout the webinar. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can, but we plan to follow up in multiple ways after today's event as well. Everyone will also be on mute for the duration of the call, which is being recorded. Now over to Dan.
Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning for some on the West Coast, and thank you all very, very much for being here. Wanted to run through the agenda real quickly so you can see how we're going to break this open. We hope that you will be joining us routinely. We're going to be doing these kinds of gatherings. During today's town hall, we'll be sharing reflections and insights on how IS is proceeding during this time. We'll also review the top of mind issues that leaders from across the sector are sharing with us. We'll focus on two specific areas today where we can offer some key updates and guidance. This town hall format will be how IS kind of plans to do our work moving forward. We want to stay connected with you all and really embrace this kind of listening, give and get strategy. Our aim is that we become even more in this new virtual world that we're living, a place where we can share with each other our concerns and our challenges, our opportunities and our breakthroughs. We want to hear from each other, both folks that are living kind of on the front lines, as well as from experts and kind of what we've learned over the years, so that we can really make sense of what is happening and collectively kind of navigate these waters that are really uncharted for any of us. We're really living in fundamentally unprecedented times. So as we begin to offer our kind of point of view, we wanted to share a little bit the principles that are guiding the work we're doing at independent sector. So you have these kind of four key principles that we are using to guide our work. The first is this notion that we pay particular attention to those on the margins, those who are most vulnerable. In a sense, that's our point of reference. Social sector, our nation will fail, we believe, unless we are paying attention to those on the margins and develop strategies that directly support them as we're all moving forward. Secondly, we believe that all of us in our work, our professional work, have to be able to be flexible with our business plans, with kind of continuity in order to be able to try and continue to do our mission today and tomorrow. And as we recover, kind of chart a pathway towards increased strength and sustainability. That means engaging boards and staff and stakeholders. We believe that no matter what we do, how we proceed matters here. We believe in this notion that we as a sector are grounded in kind of what is private action for public good. And so how we talk about our work, how we go about acting matters. And so a sense of being positive in our public discourse and trying to move towards a sense of calm and sound evidence-based advice that allows you internally to manage your organization and work with your peers and stakeholders, as well as serving the sector externally by representing kind of the values that we all aspire. And we want to be mindful of how we are responding today in everything we do. In some ways, we're casting the die for what the future could easily look like. So these are the principles that we are holding ourselves accountable to, and we ask you to hold us accountable to them. We don't expect you to embrace these. Each of you have to adapt to your own set of principles, but we offer those as a framework for the sector, and we want to make good on all of these. Many of you through this process have been sharing your questions and your current concerns with us. And so we have been listening, and we have a set of clear themes that have emerged that we're seeing from all of you as your top priorities. The first, and by far the most pressing, has been this notion of organizational sustainability. How do you kind of financially manage during these times? How does one anticipate and navigate a recession? How do you deal with fundraising and donors so that they can be part of your navigating and the solutions? And what are the strategies for business continuity? So we immediately wanted to respond to that, and we asked the Bridgespan group. And as some may know on the call, Jeff Braddock, who I know is participating, has really asked two of his national expert and colleagues from the Bridgespan group to talk with us specifically around this organizational sustainability issue. A second issue that we've heard a great deal about has been human resources. And it's very tight with the organizational sustainability. It's very much top of mind on sector leaders. And it's a range of issues we're hearing, from managing remote staff, creating supportive culture, ensuring self-care during this time, anticipating staff changes, whether that is kind of temporarily reducing work hours or workforce, or having to, in fact, lay off folks, unfortunately. I hope many of you were able to participate in the webinar we did earlier this week with Nonprofit HR that addressed many of those issues. That has been recorded and available, and we will continue to offer these sorts of responses to these questions around human resources. A third area remains very much top of mind among many of the sector leaders, and that's the public policy space. We know there's a lot going on here in Washington that will affect our sector quite directly. I'm happy to say that Independent Sector's Chief Strategy Officer, Jeff Moore, will be sharing an update today. And it really shows how we're collectively working to really defend, support, and really chart a pathway forward for the sector. And then finally, there are two other concerns that we've heard. One is generally, how do you communicate? What's the right level of communications? How do you use the various channels and strategies? We'll be addressing that at a later date. And then the final question is around community impact. And this is a real pain point for the sector. We know volunteers are engaged, and how do you engage with them remotely or protect them? We know many of our colleagues in the sector are working on the front lines and have workers, and how do you protect them and ensure continuity of service? So we will be addressing these sets of issues moving forward, and you'll hear us a lot ask for feedback. At the end of this webinar, we're going to ask you to fill out a survey so we can provide the best sets of resources in the best format that works for you. So with that, I will turn it over to Marie.
Great. Thank you so much, Dan, for offering that overview of where we stand today. Now I'd like to introduce Jeff Moore, IS's Chief Strategy Officer, for a public policy update.
Thanks, Marie. Thanks, everybody, for taking a little bit of time to update each other on where we are moving and why in our public policy work in response to the coronavirus. The first point that I want to make is that none of our policy aims, not a one of them, can be advanced by any one institution alone. Therefore, we are working in close and constant contact and coordination with our members, with other infrastructure organizations across the sector, like the National Council of Nonprofits, Council of Foundations, and many of you on this call. So thank you for that partnership. I want to organize my comments in three buckets. I tend to think in threes, as some of you will know. So the first bucket that I want to address is what policies have already been enacted, and we'll do a very, very quick review of them. The second thing that I want to spend some time talking about, perhaps most importantly, is what is coming at us, what's happening in the Congress now, and how are we navigating. And then I want to end the presentation with a request, quite frankly, to all of you for what you can do now. So that's how I'd like to proceed. So let's get started with an overview of what has been enacted, and it looks to me like that's the slide you're looking at. So on March 6th, the first piece of corona legislation was passed, and it focused heavily on aid for vaccine development and public health response. On March 18th, which seems a year ago, but was only earlier this week, HR 6201 was signed into law, This was the second aid package in response to the coronavirus. It is also known as the Families First Corona Response Act, and it provides 4 core areas of assistance. It provides for paid sick and emergency leave assistance to employers, including nonprofits. It provides additional assistance to states for paying unemployment insurance benefits. It supplements funding for food and nutrition programs, and it increases Medicaid funding to support virus-related care for the uninsured. A full overview of that second package is available on the IS website, and my hope is that many of you have already seen it. It was sent out widely earlier this week. Marie, if we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So let's talk a little bit about what is coming. So at Independent Sector, we see a critical part of our role as working in partnership with all of you to shape the future policy solutions to this crisis. So let's talk a little bit about what's before us. Last night, the Senate Republicans unveiled their version of a third assistance package. You've undoubtedly been reading about that. This package includes some important provisions that would benefit the charitable sector, and importantly, it contains some restrictions on assistance to nonprofits that are problematic and that we will be working to fix in the days ahead. Let me start on the upside in the package because there are some upsides. The Republican bill does make use of the Small Business Administration Loan Program to provide salary and other supports to nonprofits. And very importantly, the portion of those loans used by nonprofits from March 1st through June 30th to pay employee salary will not require repayment. Also on the upside, this package creates an above-the-line charitable deduction for the year of 2020 with a maximum deduction of $300. So now on the downside, and there are some real downsides, and they'll be fixed, we hope. The charitable deduction provision is a welcome recognition of the case that we have been making since 2017 about declining deductions in our sector and the need to think anew about charitable giving incentives. However, this proposal would need to be significantly expanded to meet the need charities now face. So that will be one area of our focus. Also, the Republican bill places limitations on which nonprofits qualify for this assistance, the assistance that I mentioned just above. Nonprofits with more than 500 employees and nonprofits that receive Medicaid funds are not eligible. These provisions, again, are deeply problematic and will be a focus of our lobbying efforts in the days to come. I also want to make sure that you're aware that IS is working with many of you on this call to ensure that lawmakers are looking at our sector, the charitable nonprofit sector, and its needs in the same way that they look at other critical sectors, like the airline industry. So working with many of you, we have fashioned a request package for $60 billion in support assistance to our sector. A letter went to the Hill earlier this week, I believe it was day before yesterday, outlining our request for specific policy remedies. And the provisions that we have laid out in this request package will form the backbone of many of our advocacy efforts over the next days and weeks. Let me say a couple of words about process, because this is Washington after all. The latest relief package, the one that I've just been describing, was introduced by Senate Republicans. Democrats were not involved in the crafting of the package I've just been talking about, and they are only now being invited into negotiations on the Senate side. how and when House leadership, and recall that the House does not come back into session until Tuesday of next week, how and when House leadership engages is not yet clear. For these reasons, in the hours and days ahead, the focus of our lobbying efforts will now focus on Senate Democratic leadership and in the House. Final point that I want to make on this slide, and this is, I think, tremendously important, is that while our immediate focus has to be on financial assistance and the package that we've just been talking about, and making sure that it meets the needs of our sector, I want to make sure that we are not taking our eyes off of other concerns and policy needs coming out of this crisis. We want to remember, and we spend a lot of time thinking about this as you all do, a healthy civil society is one where people give not only their dollars, but they give their time as volunteers and they vote. We're working to get smart quickly on where IS can help make sure, especially now, that we have a volunteer force that can respond in a dramatically new landscape. And we want to make certain that come November, voting from home opportunities are robust and they are consistent across the nation. There is some new legislation on the scene in the Senate regarding vote from home policies, and we're going to be looking at those very closely. Just as IS has been working with all of you on the financial aid package, we look forward to working with all of you on these and other critical needs. Together we can do this. Finally, and if we can turn to the next slide, this is what we're asking you to do now. Independent sector, starting with this slide, is pushing out a new call to action. We're asking each of you on this call to contact your legislators and to tell them that Congress must provide emergency aid to nonprofit organizations by doing a couple of things: expanding the charitable giving incentive and providing nonprofits with grants, loans, and tax credits as they are for other sectors. You can take this action in three ways. You can, as you see on the slide in front of you, right now, go to independentsector.org/act now, and that will take you to the Action Center. You can also go to Independent Sector's website homepage, and it will lead you to the same Action Center. Finally, and by the end of the day today, each of you will be receiving an email, which will give you a rule of three, a third opportunity for you to connect with that Action Center and take that action. In closing, I want to say thank you, of course, but I also want to make sure that if you've got more detailed questions, and it is very easy to go down into the weeds on these legislative proposals very quickly. That's not the intent of this call. And we're all still learning, quite frankly, about what these provisions might mean. But if you've got additional questions that we haven't covered here, that we don't have time to cover, please do send us an email at publicpolicy, all one word, publicpolicy@independentsector.org, and we will reply to you as quickly as we possibly can. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I'd like to turn now to Preeta and Maria from the Bridgespan group to offer some thoughts on the questions that we've been hearing about organizational sustainability.
Thanks, Marie. There are two things that Maria and I will be talking about today. The first is I want to share a little bit about what we are hearing from the nonprofit leaders we're working with in terms of how they're responding and what remains uncertain for them, which of course is a great deal. And then I'll turn it over to Maria to talk a little bit about what we have seen and learned from those who have weathered tough times in the past, recognizing that we are in a particularly unique and challenging moment. And so even those principles will need to be adapted at this moment in time. So if you go to the next slide, thank you, Marie. You'll see, Jeffrey, it looks like I'm going with the rule of 4 here, 4 categories of questions that we're hearing. And the thing I would note is that these are the areas of strain that we often see in the sector, that we consistently see in the sector, but they are taking new shape and form in this time. And so what I'd like to do is I'll, in each of these areas, share a little bit about what we're hearing and in the early days, what we're seeing in terms of action. So the first is just on strategy and program, the very real concern about how can we deliver on our mission under current constraints. And it's important to recognize here that the way this question and challenge manifests itself varies significantly depending on the kind of program or business model that you have. So I am certain that on this conversation, we have folks who are in situations, you know, where perhaps they're an intermediary who can do a good amount of their work from home and shifting through online formats. We have others who are, you know, arts and culture institutions that may have shut down altogether and are looking at a very different set of challenges. And those, like our human service or education colleagues on the front line who are seeing both huge demand, but great shifts and threats to their own staff and how they deliver. And so how one responds is going to vary. And one of the things we're actively thinking about, and I'm sure the independent sector team is as well, is how to connect those who within those areas who are facing like challenges, so that the innovation that we're also seeing can spread as quickly as possible within those fields. And so let me just note there that that innovation and creativity is what has been inspiring in this moment. So we are seeing that flexibility, and I think we always knew this about ourselves, that we are actually a quite flexible and resilient sector because we've always operated under constraint. Some of what we're seeing is creativity at the program level. So I was talking with a nonprofit client in Seattle that does homeless youth services, and you know, how do they shift their program model to limit exposure, and you know, whether it's having staff who have longer shifts or shifting to a shelter-in-place model. There's things like that people are thinking about. There's also broader program mix and strategy questions. So organizations that, you know, maybe had somewhat backburnered their online approaches, but are now seeing huge shifts in demand and a renewed interest in that, but also have a bricks and mortar program. How do they think about that? Their ability to think about that actually depends a lot on the financial bucket. And so I'll go there. I think the reality is, while we are resilient and creative, our ability to do that depends a lot on the response we hear from our funders and what we see on the revenue side. And so I think, you know, Jeffrey, it's great to hear the efforts that IS has underway at the federal level. I think there's an equal eagerness from nonprofits to understand what state and local funding flows are shifting and how they can advocate for those, given, again, that so much of the folks who are on the front lines of doing this work get their funds that way and have typically been quite constrained in how they use those funds, and so need to see a show of support and flexibility, similar to what I think we have all nicely seen from some of our philanthropic partners. So I think most people on this call, if you haven't already seen the pledge that I think over 100 funders have signed to really try and be with us in this moment and helpful to us in this moment, I think that's exactly the kind of thing we want to see more of. It is particularly essential as all of us shift to also thinking about the continuity planning that Dan mentioned earlier, and that Maria will talk about in a moment. The other couple of areas I'll just note is, one is just on organization and how we support our staff and new systems of working. And again, this varies significantly by type of organization you're in. The thing that I will note that has been, again, inspiring from the field is the care with which we take care of our people, internally, as well as the clients we work with. And so one of the questions and the places that I see, again, creativity is in how leaders and teams are trying to find ways to continue the sense of community that has always been a power in how we all work together. And how does one do that digitally or in safe ways that continue to keep our spirits up at this tough time? And so as we gather resources for the field, Bridgespan, I think that's a place, along with these others, that we will be sharing tips and tricks, as I think you all are at Independent Sector as well. The last thing I'll note is leadership and how our leadership approach needs to respond and evolve. I think Dan already mentioned this question of communications. I think it has been, you know, a new level of communication, whether it's with our funders or with our staff, that's been required of our leaders. I have seen folks doing that tremendously well. The thing I would note is that in this world in which this is a marathon but not a sprint, the one area of concern I sometimes have is how those leaders are themselves taking care of themselves, because I think they are all investing, as many of you on this call are, in taking care of their people. And so, you know, again, thinking about how we might pull together resources, and nonprofit HR may have spoken to this in previous sessions, to make sure that we care for ourselves as well for the long haul. The last thing I'll just note, because I just found it so apt, was this quote from Will Berkowitz, the CEO of Jewish Family Service of Seattle, who I spoke to last week, and you know, who just noted on all of these dimensions, he feels he has a tremendous team and they're doing the best they can, but they truly are whitewater rafting in the fog. And so there's a lot of pivoting and a lot of rapid response within uncertainty of what's to come. And you know, to that end, I'll just note that, you know, Maria will share some tips and supports we've seen from previous cycles, not totally like this, but a little bit like this, and that we too will seek to kind of develop the tools and supports we can as the fog starts to lift. Maria, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Preeta. As Preeta mentioned, last fall, before there was any inkling of COVID-19 and the current context, Bridgespan undertook some work to understand a little bit about what had other nonprofit organizations done in the past in hard times to weather those hard times. And as Preeta mentioned, we are truly in an unprecedented situation. There's so many things that are unique and still uncertain and unknown about, you know, what's going to happen, both in terms of things that are impacting the daily services and work that you do, things that are impacting the economic situation and the broader economy. What does that mean from a funding perspective? But we did think it would be helpful to share with you some of the things, tips, tricks, and just principles that have been relevant and helpful in the past, and wanted to today really just focus on three that, you know, based on the conversations that we've been having and what we're hearing from the field, seem to be the topics and issues that are most relevant and top of mind. And so I will spend, instead of going through all 8, I will spend a little bit of time going through the first 3. So Marie, if you just flip to the next slide. Talking a little bit more about acting quickly and planning contingencies, talking a little bit more about people, and then also sharing some thoughts about funder communication and relationships. So I'll start with the first one, which is about acting quickly, but not reflexively, and also planning contingencies. And there are 2 sets of activities that are related to that. First are things that are sort of reactive to do in the short term, and things that you could start to do to plan looking forward. And really the challenge is doing both of these and balancing the two. So on the short term, the activities that we heard from others who faced critical situations that were really important to do were to understand the scope of the challenge as quickly as possible. And I recognize that we're in the first days of this, and that is difficult, but I think the work that IS is doing, the work that others are doing, just to try to understand, what's going on, what does, government funding bills mean for the nonprofit sector, as well as understanding other things is one way to do that. So just getting smart and getting as much information as possible. The second is really focusing on the most critical central things to your mission. Those are your core services. There are all sort of new paths and new things or opportunities for expansion. I think that many nonprofits are considering, but now is the time to really think about what's core and what's a quote unquote nice to have. You may have to consider delaying new initiatives or starting new things that you as an organization were hoping to do in the short term and even later this year. But given the challenge and the context today, you may have to make the call to potentially consider delaying those. And I would say lastly, now is the time, really to manage and be aware of your costs aggressively, to have that information, at hand on a regular basis, to understand, what is sort of the current situation of your costs, and the day-to-day business that you are also trying to manage. Just a couple of practical suggestions and things that we've heard from folks who are trying to lean into this. So I did mention that information is key, but we're also having to move towards new ways and new strategies and approaches for sharing that information. So, we've seen many organizations move towards daily updates where, they're sharing good information, maybe not perfect, but good is better than perfect in this situation. So there are new ways of meeting and communicating that could be helpful in this circumstance. Then on the forward-looking side, it's starting to think about, scenario planning for best and worst case scenario. And when we say scenario planning, it's not just about your funding, right? Although I do think that's a critical component. So asking yourself, what you might do or potentially delay if, worst case scenario, your funding is cut by 20% next year, or you face a shortfall, or 40% next year, or you face a significant shortfall this year. But it's also about scenario planning for different situations. What happens if, for example, the current situation extends past the summer, and particularly for nonprofits that are working with school-age children, what does that mean for the next school year? So it is worth the investment of the time to take and consider what might be a series of potential futures and think about what would be the response associated with that. Another element of this is just identifying trigger points for action. So, for example, one of the things that we heard from nonprofits that had faced difficult financial situations in the past was sort of developing a point of view about metrics that would indicate a certain action or not. And that might be something that you would potentially invest in doing. And then lastly, developing contingencies. So, understanding, what you might do if a certain situation happens and starting to plan for that in advance. Another theme that came very clearly through our conversations with nonprofits who had faced similar or challenging circumstances in the past was just a deep focus and investment on people. And I think this is something that we've heard even today and from others, is just the amount of care and support that nonprofits are investing in for their team. And this is the time to really double down on that. And particularly double down on the core group of individuals that are most critical to the impact of the organization that you're working on, from a care, a focus, a support, and a retention perspective. And remember that this is part of the team that actually can be really helpful to helping you manage through those tough times. So one suggestion we heard is to very deliberately bring them in as part of the problem solving team to help you manage through these. And then lastly, we also heard that organizations that manage through difficult, tough times stayed very close to key funders. And there's a series of practices and messages for nonprofits as well as funders. So the nonprofits, one of the things we heard is transparency is key. Let funders know what you are seeing. In many ways, you are their eyes and ears on the ground. Be transparent on how you will respond and explain the choices you might make. Ask for transparency from funders in return in terms of their plans, how the current situation is impacting payouts or their strategies, and also explore ways to renegotiate restrictions on timing and on grants. We've already seen circumstances where funders have announced that they're willing to be more flexible and change sort of restrictions on grants and payouts. And so there is openness on their end. And then on funders, there are some clear messages too. So for them, weighing how big and small decisions could actually make a huge impact on grantees. Being open and transparent on how the current situation and looking forward, as we think about the economic potential and the, if a recession does come to play, how does that actually manage their and to impact their resources? And even just more deliberately helping grantees with risk management or including contingency funds in grants, recognizing that there may be some emergencies and unknowns that are going to appear in the work that we do, especially in the coming months. And then lastly, one thing I'll just say, and this was a very clear theme that came through in the research that we did recently, is that and Dan, you mentioned this in the beginning, that in challenging times, it is even more critical to place a focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. In many ways, some of our most marginalized communities are doubly impacted by the current context that we're facing. And so just a couple of ways that plays out. So one is, when you are potentially making some of these difficult trade-offs, being really clear about what might be some unintended consequences of the decisions that you make. So for example, if you have to close, particular programs or delay initiatives, is it affecting one community more than another? Another thing, and particularly for funders to think through, is that we know that in good times, that leaders of color have disproportionate barriers and less access to funding, particularly for emergency and contingency funding. And we anticipate that in tough times, the access to that is going to be even heightened and more difficult. So just being really aware of that, in challenging times going forward.
Great. Thank you so much, Maria and Preeta, for those really important insights as we think about the road ahead. What I'd like to do now is invite folks to continue sending in your questions as we move to the town hall portion of the event today. So please continue to share your questions either in the chat box or in the Q&A box. And while you're doing that, we actually wanted to get your input on some of the emerging themes that we're hearing about that we're not able to go into detail about today. So we're going to put 3 polls up on your screen in order and ask for your thoughts about which issues are top of mind for you based on what we're hearing so far. So I'm going to launch the first poll around HR issues. Again, these are what we're hearing. I'm sure there are many others, but curious to hear from you. What are the HR issues that are top of mind for you? You can vote for more than one. And I think folks can see kind of what's coming up on the screen here. So this is really interesting and will help us determine where to follow up for additional events and resources. So we're going to give folks about a minute or so to respond, and then we'll put up our next question. So we're seeing a lot of these are issues that folks are thinking about right now, which is helpful to hear. Okay, so take a few last seconds if you have thoughts on HR issues. Otherwise, I'm going to close this one out, and we're going to show our next poll around communications issues. So same kind of question, based on what we're hearing so far, which of these communications issues are top of mind for you? Again, we know there may be others. Feel free to select more than one. We'll give you about a minute to respond, and feel free to keep those questions coming as well. And I apologize, I thought folks could see the responses. I see now that you can't unless we show it to you at the end. So I will do that as we hit the end of the communications poll. Thank you for letting me know. We'll take just about another couple seconds here. Great, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and share the results this time. So now you all can see what we heard from the folks on the call in terms of the communications issues that are top of mind. I'm seeing hitting the right tone and key messages as the top issue, as well as communicating effectively to donors. Great, and now I'm going to move us to our third poll, which is around community impact. Which community impact issues are top of mind for you? Again, these are some things that we're starting to hear from the field. Feel free to select more than one, and we'll show you the results in about a minute. And I'm hearing we still couldn't see the slides, or the poll, so I apologize for that. And thanks for learning with us as we are doing this on the call today. I'm going to stop the share, so hopefully once we end the polling this time, you will be able to see what the responses were, and it looks like they've slowed down, so I'm going to end the polling and try this again. And it looks like that worked. So apologies for that. You will definitely share the responses after in some of our follow-up materials, but I will also read out that meeting the needs of the most marginalized or vulnerable populations was the #1 issue that came up here, as well as transitioning to online services and programs. So I'll let folks take another look at that, and then we're going to transition to Q&A. And there's one common question that's come in about whether materials will be made available after the call. Yes, we will be sharing out the recording and materials that have been shared today, so you can expect to receive all of that from us. And so I'm just going to take a quick look through here and see, we're getting some questions in about moving forward with fundraising and handling loss of revenues from canceled events. Lots of sector conferences have been canceled, and I know there are many more on the calendar, and that looks like something that folks are thinking about. Certainly, you know, that relates to some of the work we do here at Independent Sector. And so I'm curious whether anyone from our staff or the Bridgespan team would like to speak about, you know, how nonprofits may think about, you know, when a signature event is impacted by something like the coronavirus response, what might be some of the ways to respond or think about that?
This is Dan. So I know I'm going to tee up Jeff in a minute because this has come up. We've heard a fair amount of this. And this is certainly something that we're thinking about from a policy perspective, that there may be some policy reliefs that would enable both the businesses as well as the nonprofits to figure out how to thread this needle. It is a serious issue. The frontline issues are certainly kind of jamming people right now as the most vulnerable. So we're trying to prioritize this, and this obviously affects our work as well. So we're acutely aware of it. And there's lots of techniques around negotiating with funders and with your vendors, postponing events that you've already allocated resources. There's a cash flow issue that has to be taken into account. And then I've noticed that a lot of funders are beginning to try and figure out how to be flexible with the resources they have so that they can hold either shift this to virtual reality or enable nonprofits to use funds differently to be able to make up the losses. But I'll turn it over to my colleagues if they want to respond.
No, I think that what you're saying, Dan, is exactly right in what I've seen so far, though a lot is, of course, TBD, both the creativity of trying to try some alternative approaches and the flexibility from funders.
Great, thank you, Dan and Preetya. So we've had a question about communicating with legislators as an element of how we might think about communications. So Jeff, I'd love to throw that to you and see what thoughts you'd like to offer on communicating effectively with legislators at this time.
Sure. I think the question in part was teed up by the polling that we just did. Obviously, communication to legislators right now is critical. And the first thing that, again, I would suggest for those of you who might have joined late in the call is to go back to the call to action that we have just pushed out. And right there, you will begin to find, we hope, some helpful messaging, core points that you can be taking to your legislators, consistently starting now. The other thing that we will be looking at, and I know has been part of the ongoing conversation with peer organizations in the infrastructure space, with the Leadership 18 community, is pulling together talking point toolkits in support of our legislative aims. So that's something that I'm going to be taking away from this conversation to see how we can provide some very, very targeted messaging assistance to the folks in the community. But again, I would just reiterate, as I did early, that you need to be talking to your legislators and reminding them that the nonprofit sector, they need to be looking at the nonprofit sector like they look at other sectors in the economy. I use the example of the airline industry. And that we can't be an afterthought. So again, we'll be taking feedback from this conversation forward, thinking about how we can put together some targeted talking points for broader use.
Great, thanks so much, Jeff. I want to jump in with another question here, which is about managing a crisis that feels different, really different than other things that we've seen in the past. And the person who asked this shared, what are we starting to learn about what's different this time, knowing it's early days? But even if we have experience managing through a crisis, what are you seeing that's different, and how might we start to anticipate responding to that? So I'll open that to anyone who wants to jump in.
So I've been talking, I'll actually ask our Bridgespan colleagues too, because they've, I think, been real experts at different kinds of crises. So they've already provided some great insights. But I've talked to a number of folks, a number of our members who run very large networks of folks that are doing frontline work. And I think what we're pervasively hearing, right, is that we're getting this from all sides. Historically in 2008, it was a financial crisis. And that was devastating and extremely difficult, but it didn't actually disrupt how each of us did our work other than the financial constraints that we had to navigate. This is obviously a time when all of us have had to shift fundamentally in how we do our work at the same time that we're trying to figure out financially what the implications are. We haven't had a pandemic, so we actually don't know, is this 6 weeks, 6 months, 18 months, 36 months? What will happen with employment rates? What will happen with frontline workers? What will happen with the multiple institutions? I was, an organization like Independent Sector, in some ways we are designed to be right in place when something like this happens, and yet we're a membership organization, right? We depend on dues. We know that folks are going to have struggle with dues. So everybody is trying to figure out what the variables are that directly affect them. And there are very little playbooks that have the combination of things. So the reason I think we are doing this is the sense-making function. We are trying to figure out what collectively we're all seeing and pooling the best wisdom and smarts and strategies so that they become collective knowledge as quickly as possible. Because I think it is only through collective action that we are going to be able to help each other navigate through this. But I don't know if our friends at Bridgespan want to add from your experience.
I mean, the thing I would note, and I think one of the folks in chat already mentioned this, is that, as you said, Dan, it's the scope and scale of it. It's just everything for hitting everyone, as opposed to a particular geographic area or part of the world or particular sector. It's hitting us all. So that is, of course, unprecedented. The other thing that I just think about is, because of that, it is hard to imagine that how we work after this will not be significantly affected, meaning that the extent to which we are all working like this right now makes me wonder what that will look like down the road. So it's a small thing, but I just imagine years from now, we might see this as a moment when a lot shifted for a long time.
Kathleen Olson made a point that this affects everyone, kind of equally. It's not just geographic or around a particular sector, which I think is extremely smart and spot on. The other dimension that I would just say is that if ever there was a time for, in a sense, citizen action, it is now. On a plus side, I was speaking with some folks, and I asked, well, what are the bright spots? And they said, what is amazing is we as a sector were designed to be in response to the building of community or the rebuilding of community. While we're being challenged to do it in a fundamentally different way, it is in a sense our moment to contribute in a profound way, with this notion of putting the human person at the center of that and asking how we steward the environment in the building of community. And this may, painful as it is, and it is certainly no one would wish this upon us, let's not squander the opportunity for the sector to just fully embrace this and innovate and learn and show up the way we best we can.
So as we know, things are very much happening in real time. And in the spirit of that, I'd actually like to turn back to Jeff to offer an update on the Senate negotiations that are happening as we're on this call.
Sure. So thanks, Marie. So the one thing that I just learned from our colleagues at Washington Counsel Ernst & Young is that bipartisan Senate negotiations actually have started. They started earlier this morning. And so, because I know we're getting a lot of questions about key offices to target, especially on the Senate side, I thought I would mention the folks that per Wes at Ernst & Young, we know to be in those negotiations. Not surprisingly, Republican and Democratic leadership, so Senators McConnell and Schumer, Senators Spoon and Durbin. From Banking Committee, Senators Crapo, Toomey, Brown, and Reed. From Finance, Senators Grassley, Portman, Wyden, Stabenow, and Menendez. From Small Business, critical to the conversation we had earlier about SBA loans, Senators Rubio, Collins, Cardin, and Shaheen.
Great, thanks, Jeff.
Yeah, we'll keep you all updated as we learn kind of the status of those negotiations and as we think about target offices and talking points to the last question I responded to.
Great, thank you. So we have time for just about one more question, and I apologize we're not able to get to everyone today, but certainly we'll be following up. And the last question, I'd love to hear everyone actually chime in on this. It's a little bit of a two-parter, but someone has asked about how we keep folks engaged and inspired during this time, whether it's a volunteer, a staff person, or keep ourselves engaged and inspired. And so would love to hear from all of our speakers, maybe starting with Dan. What is something that's keeping you engaged and inspired during this time? And then Dan will let you end with some closing remarks.
Sure. So briefly, just on I try to practice self-care to keep myself strong as best I can. Well, all of us are pulling long hours as we're navigating this. Meditation is a big part of how I do that, and I'm finding it particularly important at this moment. In terms of inspiring, I think for those of us who are in leadership positions, and in some ways we're all in leadership positions, it just varies kind of how we show up in an organization or in our community. This notion of being other-centered and listening about what is top of mind for folks, and recognizing that each of us process differently. And I think it is a leader's responsibility to try to adapt to where someone is at, and not necessarily solve their problems or provide advice all the time, but to acknowledge and listen and feedback what you're hearing so we can be present to each other. Because I think we're all in real time trying to make sense of it. And insofar as we're not alone in that process, we can actually feel like we're being heard and someone else is carrying that worry with us, even if it's not your worry. I think can be very, very powerful at this time. I think there are other things you can do, but I just think that human connection, when we've gone virtual and we can't connect with each other, to do that in the best way we possibly can is a powerful way to inspire.
Thanks, Jeff. Preeta or Maria, I'm wondering if I could turn to one of you next if you have thoughts.
Sure. It's a great question, and I guess good for us to all be asking ourselves regularly. Actually, is how we are caring for ourselves and staying inspired. I think, as I said earlier in my thoughts, there's quite a bit that I'm seeing leaders do that is in and of itself inspiring, and that leadership can come from all sorts of places in an organization. A colleague of ours, Maria's and mine, organized an impromptu, 11 a.m. Costume party via Zoom, and said, I think he sent the invite at 10:30 and said, find something in the room you're working in and use it for costume and come on and join. And it was amazing, the creativity that people showed and the connection that allowed us to have even for a few minutes. And so I just appreciate that in the midst of all this. And the only other thing I would say is that I am trying, and I would encourage us all to try and set the bar appropriately for ourselves. I think on this, I read a great piece yesterday, I think in the New York Times, from someone who said, no, I refuse to continue to homeschool my child to the same standard that my teacher did. I'm not that professional, and I do think there's a lot we're all trying to do excellently right now, and where we can give ourselves a break, I think that's wonderful too.
Great. Jeff, do you want to jump in?
Sure, thanks, Marie. So on the personal side, I'm doing an awful lot of walking. And it was interesting this morning, very early, taking the dog for a walk and had a conversation with a neighbor from across the street. Literally, we're having the conversation on opposite sides of the street, talked about how much walking we're doing, and we kind of chuckled that one of the bright sides in all of this is that we may be addressing one epidemic, namely the obesity epidemic in America, as we live through coronavirus. And it's not to sound glib, but I do think that there are ways to self-improve even in really, really difficult times. The inspiring thing for me, or the inspirational thing for me, I guess, is that I would hope in all that we do, whether we're talking about how we're treating our employees in this time, how we're shaping legislative policy response to a crisis, how we're managing at an organizational level, operational level, that in all we do, we're inspiring trust, and that we're building trust in the sector, because at the end of the day, that's our currency. And now's a time when we need to be able to use that currency.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. And Dan, I know we're right at time, so I'll turn to you for a few quick closing remarks.
So first, I just want to thank everybody who joined. It is, in a sense, in solidarity that we stand and we innovate together. So huge, huge gratitude. Super big shout out to our colleagues, Maria and Prita at the Bridgespan group, who spent precious time when I know you have clients and a lot of demands. So thank you for sharing your wisdom. Marie, thanks for the facilitation as always. Jeff and the team who've been slugging hard on the policy work, rest assured to the community that's on, he and the team have this, but it'll only be effective if we have collective action. So please lean in. This is the time to raise up your voice. Our work matters in a profound, really in a game-changing way. So we will continue to do this. We look very much forward to getting better at this. So you're going to get, as Marie will probably tell you, a survey right after this. We just ask you to stay on and fill it out. It will help us be better for you, and be kind of clear about the best ways to support you all. So with that, I want to thank everybody. I know I had a number of board members on the call, so thanks for joining. And I'll turn it back to you, Marie.
Great. Thank you so much, Dan. That closes us out for today. As Dan said, you should see a survey pop up when we exit out or when you close, and you'll also receive it via email as well as the materials. So thank you again for joining, and we'll be in conversation again soon.